Okay, I'm going to wait maybe for the next 2 minutes and see if people are coming through. We're live on 1893 Mtwagazi Human Rights Restoration Movement. This is one of the most important lectures ever to be done by people who are involved or people who understand what happened in Zimbabwe, in post-colonial Zimbabwe, in Matebeleland and Midlands areas. Right. I want to begin my lecture by talking about myself, who am I, and I'll also look into the my personal experiences in Zimbabwe in relation to the 5th Brigade massacres. The principal aim of this lecture, this presentation, is to explain what is happening in relation to the 5th Brigade victims' exhumations, reburials, which are being planned at the moment by the Zimbabwe National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, NPRC. Right, my name is Dr. Admore Tshuma. I'm a lecturer at UK University. Well, I have a strong background in journalism, although I left journalism a long time ago, but I have been, for example, my PhD is based on social justice, redistribution of resources, reparative justice, recognition. Right. The reason why I decided to do a PhD focusing on transitional justice is because of my experience from Zimbabwe. My first job in Zimbabwe, one of my first jobs, and well, let me say so, was to work as a journalist, and I worked as a journalist at the Chronicle. The Chronicle is one of the biggest newspapers. Unfortunately, is kind of state-owned. But during my time when I started the Chronicle, it was a little bit more kind of independent. Not independent in the sense of being independent. It was still controlled by the state. But I mean to say that we had a little bit of independence to kind of write certain things which cannot be published by journalists today in the same newspaper. Right. I'll begin my presentation with a very personal story. One day I was assigned by the editor of the Chronicle to go and do what is called Matebeleland Roundup. Now, Matebeleland Roundup was when journalists will basically go to rural areas. They give you a car and you go with a photographer. They give you a car, then you drive to Matebeleland, to any specific area. So in my case, I happened to be assigned to cover Cholocho, to do what was called a Cholocho Roundup. The first thing when we arrived in Cholocho, we met the district administrator. By then, that was a guy called Mr. Nyoni. The sad thing is that that very Mr. Nyoni lost his job because of me, because of us, because of what we wrote. Now, what happened is we went to Mr. Nyoni and asked Mr. Nyoni if there were any interesting stories in his area. Now, Mr. Nyoni basically said, oh, What are you looking for? What kind of, it depends what kind of stories you're looking for. We said any kind of a story. Then he said, go to this particular homestead. There are mass graves in that particular homestead. He gave us the directions. We drove, myself and my photographer by then, who was a guy called Zibusiso Ndlovu. When we arrived there, we met an old woman. We drove right into the yard, into a homestead. She looked at us with a great suspicion. She looked so tired. You can tell that she was a traumatized person. So what we did is, I asked her a question and said, oh, Mom, we need a story about what happened to you during the deployment of the 5th Brigade. She sat down right in the middle of the homestead, looked at me close to about two minutes without responding. Before she responded to me, I could see tears rolling down her cheeks. Then I got panicked, saying, what's going on here now? What is going on? Then I asked her and said, tell me something, Mama. Why are you crying? She said, my son, I'm even scared of talking to you. There are people who came exactly driving cars like the cars you are driving. Soon after those people coming in, then the 5th Brigade, guys who were dressed in camouflaged army and red berets, carrying AK-47s, would come in here and start to brutalize us. She said, can you see that corner there in my yard? I said, yes. He said, go there. We followed this woman. Actually, she followed us. Me and Zibusiso went right to the corner of the homestead. And then there were small stones, kind of arranged small stones, which sounded so much insignificant. And then because Zibusiso was a little bit more experienced photojournalist, then he said to me, Admore, listen, this is a mass grave. I said, what do you mean? A grave shouldn't look like this. He said, I can tell you. Zibusiso started taking pictures of those small stones. Then the woman followed us. When she followed us, she said, she started literally crying. He said, do you know how many people are here? He said, all my family is here. My husband is here. My children are here. My grandchildren are here. There are literally 7 people here. I'm talking about something which I saw with the evidence of my own eyes. This is not something which is written down, but it's something which I saw. I was a young, naive journalist beginning to understand how the world works. I had heard about the 5th Brigade, but I never knew that it can be so brutal. I never knew that I could encounter somebody who has basically came face to face with the brutality of the 5th Brigade. The woman was crying uncontrollable. I comforted her. I assured her. She said to me, the only reason why I'm talking to you, my son, is because you seem to be speaking fluent in Ndebele. Because the people who did this to me were speaking in Shona. That's what she said to me. I asked her to explain, although I still blame myself up to now because my questions were a little bit more intrusive. I was a journalist looking for a new story. She explained to me how her pregnant daughter-in-law, who was almost 5 months pregnant, was bayoneted to death. Her womb opened with a bayonet because they said, she said in her own words, we want to see how does Ndebele a dissident baby looks like before they're born. She said to me that when the first to go into the mass grave was her husband, her son, his son, was literally asked to put an axe to cut his head into two using an axe. The moment he tried to resist that, he was being bayoneted on his bums, bayoneted like that. Go on, go on, go on, ita, ita, iwe, ita. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a story that has not been told properly in our country. This is a story that represents an unrecorded crime against humanity. I thought this would be imperative for me to introduce my presentation today with my personal experience, because I'm from a journalistic point of view. Well, I've been invited to make a presentation of the Matebeleland Genocide's Exhumations, which have recently been announced by the Zimbabwe National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, NPRC. My presentation is intended to stimulate public debate within Zimbabwe and internationally on human rights abuses which took place in Matebeleland and Midlands areas in the 1980s. My question is, should the perpetrator be responsible for exhumations and reburials? My answer is no. It's adding insult to an injury. Now, to explain, to back up my argument, I wish to start off with a conceptual framework for reconciliation. Because my understanding is to say that the NPRC of Zimbabwe, the current NPRC, was formed in order to reconcile a deeply divided society. I wish to make an argument that the NPRC is conceptually problematic. The NPRC does not have the qualifications to do that job under the present circumstances. When a crime of this magnitude has been committed in any country in the world, it requires a more advanced, a more conceptual, a more socially constructed arrangement to execute the exhumations, the reburials, not the one what we are seeing in Zimbabwe at the moment. That's a whitewash. Now, Dr. Ignas Torrent Oliver of Hertfordshire University here in the UK now argues that reconciliation remains one of the most complex concepts because of its multi-dimensional nature. Now, two dimensions or perspectives have been discussed by Dr. Ignas Oliver. The first dimension that he discusses is on reconciliation as an outcome, which is a state in which people have changed their relationships and they are mutually recognizing each other and they have the same goals and they want to create a peaceful environment. My question is, does the NPRC fit in this framework? Now, the second perspective, which is being discussed by Dr. Ignas Torrent Oliver, is the shift of attention to how reconciliation unfolds in terms of motivations, in terms of goals, in terms of beliefs, in terms of emotions of people who are involved. Now, according to this perspective, the victim and the perpetrator have an opportunity to transform to a nature of their relationship which facilitate a social contract, which facilitate a kind of a consensus. My question is, does the NPRC fit in this framework? The answer is no. The problem with the Zimbabwean NPRC, although they say it was formed out of the new Zimbabwean constitution, this needed an intellectual input. We had an opportunity to learn from truth commissions such as the Truth Commission of South Africa, our neighbor, such as the Truth Commission from Sierra Leone, the Truth Commission from various countries around the world. Basically, in the last 40 years, we have had over 40 truth commissions around the world, including Zimbabwe has had a truth commission. A truth commission, you need the findings to be published. But the truth commission that Zimbabwe had, the findings were never published because the truth was too damaging to be published. Remember the Dumbuchena Truth Commission. Now, in this case, truth as a process puts reconciliation in a wider perspective of reconstruction, of perpetrator sitting down in a restorative with the victim. The truth and reconciliation is one of the most important things when you talk about the exhumations. So my argument is, what I want to put forward here is to say, the current exhumations are perpetrator-led. The current exhumations are inadequate because the perpetrator is basically calling the tune and driving the process and therefore wrapping truth and justice. The NPRC is basically a sanitization program. It is problematic. It is problematic because the current government, particularly President Emmerson Mnangagwa, is hugely implicated in the deployment of the 5th Brigade. So if anybody is to be prosecuted in Zimbabwe, Emmerson Mnangagwa, the Zimbabwean government, will have to go to court to answer allegations of mass murder, of genocides, in which 20,000 people were killed. What has made this thing more like a sanitization program is the deployment of Chief Charumbira to lead the exhumation processes. Why would you deploy Chief Charumbira when people who came, armed men, the 5th Brigade, came to Matebeleland, forcing people of Matebeleland to speak in Shona, to sing songs in Shona? As though that was not enough, those who were failing to speak in Shona were being butchered, murdered, brutalized in a grossly unprecedented, uncivilized manner. And then you bring in another Shona-speaking chief, as if Matebeleland doesn't have chiefs. This is a little bit weird. What kind of a country do we have? I ask myself, what kind of Zimbabwe am I going to hand over to my children? This is very depressing. We need to assume and adopt some international programs which have been coined by the United Nations. We need to follow imported program. Because what I want to say is that what people don't understand is if the issue of the 5th Brigade is not properly handled, there will be further social fragmentation, socio-politically fragmentation. Now, to avoid further social fragmentation, there is a need to respect the will of the relatives of the victims, not to respect the will of the perpetrators, which takes the perpetrators out of this process. We need a neutral truth commission that is led by a bishop. If we can't have a bishop in Zimbabwe who can lead this project, we then need the United Nations to move in. Because the issue of the 5th Brigade massacres in Matebeleland have been recognized by the United Nations as a genocide, which means the international law. Can I just say this? The deployment of the 5th Brigade to Matebeleland was a breach of the international law. It was a breach of the Additional Protocol of 1977, which states clearly that if you deploy an army to a particular place in your country, allegedly there is a problem, and then that army happens to target civilians, therefore you have committed crimes against humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to speak about the 5th Brigade. Look at the Holocaust, which happened over 70 years ago. Even right now, Germany is still paying the Jews. They have paid over $4 billion towards the Jews. That's reparative justice. Over 70 years ago. Nancy Fraser, one of the most respected social theorist of social justice, says where injustices have been perpetrated, we need recognition and we need transformative justice. Professor Priscilla Hayner, one of the most respected experts in transitional justice, says no country in the world has ever moved on where no truth has been said, no adequate, decent cultural burials had been done. In Zimbabwe, there will be no cultural exhumations if it is perpetrator-led. So we need to respect the will of the victims. The process, in other words, it must be victim-led. This is when we can begin the road to the promised land. This is when we can begin the road to a working relationship between truth and justice. A focus on restorative justice needs to be adopted in Zimbabwe, with an emphasis that is placed on mechanisms of restorative justice and survivors. Through a reparative policy, we need reparative justice. We can also need a state-led acknowledgement for the wrongs. We don't want somebody to say that was a moment of madness. We want somebody to acknowledge that Gokura Hundi was a crime against humanity. We need condemnation, public condemnation, public apology. We need to build symbolic monuments. We need a Gokura Hundi monument in Balahwe, in Cholocho, even in Bulawayo. Together, we can achieve a transformation. We need to know who gave orders, why, what had happened. And one other important thing, what should happen is the priority of changing The Mugabe scenario of Shona supremacy conditions, characterized by gross tribal inequalities and oppression, must be dealt with. We are all Zimbabweans. We are all equal. Just last week here, I had somebody from Harare was telling me that is in the UK. Imagine somebody coming all the way from Harare to the UK to say people from Harare are more superior. That was Mugabe's intention. That is the kind of a nation in post-colonial Zimbabwe Mugabe wanted to construct. Before I end, I also want just to give a brief explanation on what this has to be done in terms of the exhumation. We need what is called the forensic pathology. We need to apply forensic apology in these exhumations. And we need a neutral, independent body that has got no links with the government. Exhumation in the forensic pathology is an act of lawfully bringing out the dead bodies through a medical purpose. This process basically will also have to carry out post-mortems, examination of the remains, and this will also help in terms of finding out the pathogenesis and the pathophysiology of events that will explain how people died. Apart from finding out how people died through the forensic pathology, we are most likely to find the identity, the true identity of those people. And again, in order to conclude my presentation, I just want to bring you into the concept of social justice. Kukura Hundi, I'm going to say this again, was not only about hatred against the people of Matebeleland. Because forget about the issue of dissidents. Dissidents were created by Robert Mugabe's government as a justification to exterminate the Ndebeles. If ZIPRA had risen against the government of Zimbabwe, there is nowhere Mugabe was going to stand. Mugabe was going to run. There's nowhere. Those were highly trained men. Even Joshua Nkomo denied responsibility. Look out Masuku, Dumiso Tabengo, they all denied responsibility of the dissidents. And how many were there? We are told there were less than 100. Did that justify the murder of the brutal murder of 20,000 civilians? So the principle of the 5th Brigade was to create tribal inequalities, was to destroy the Ndebele nation. According to Nancy Fraser, in today's modern world, when such things have happened, there need to be claims for social justice. And these claims for social justice have basically been divided into two strands. There is what we call redistributive justice. We seek more of redistribution and resources, because when people are persecuted, they lose materially. They don't go to school, they don't get jobs, no human development. That was the principle of the 5th Brigade. Now, secondly, according to Nancy Fraser, another social justice claim is the politics of recognition. When I talk about the politics of recognition, is to give people of Matebeleland, the victims, to lead the exhumations themselves. How can the perpetrator be the prosecutor? That is a fallacy, adding insult to an injury. Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Tshuma. Thank you.